Hello everybody and welcome to Lecture 7 of Logic and Critical Thinking. In this lecture we turn our attention to the issue of clarity. So at this point in the course we've set up what the course was, we discussed what arguments are in general, that's what we did in Section 1, and then in Section 2 we went through in much more detail discussing what arguments are and also how to identify the two basic kinds and then assess them as well. So at this point in the course we're done with arguments for the most part, right? We're done with what it looks like to identify an argument or what it takes to identify an argument, what you're looking for, and so on. We're not going to worry so much about assessing arguments. At this point in the course, we are concerned instead with other issues that confront a critical thinker, right? So this is logic and critical thinking. So we've discussed for the most part, all the argument stuff, right, that we're going to discuss. So now we move on, and in this section, right, we're going to discuss, so the next section, Section 4, the last section, is all about fallacies, mistakes in reasoning, typical mistakes in arguments. But in this section, we're going to discuss some other related issues for the critical thinker. So obviously clarity, that's what we're what we're going to discuss in this particular lecture, and then credibility, the idea of credibility, when should we be suspicious of a claim and for what reasons? That'll be the subject matter of the next lecture, and then we'll start dabbling in the idea of rhetoric. Okay, that'll be the subject of lecture, what will that be, 9. So that's what we have to look forward to in terms of this particular section, Section 3. Again, all our issues related are issues that are important to a critical thinker that aren't specifically related to arguments per se. Okay, so we're setting aside arguments and we're discussing other important issues for a critical thinker. Okay, so in this particular lecture, as I mentioned, right, we're going to be discussing this issue of clarity, okay, how to be as clear as possible in terms of what we are conveying to others, okay, and then also being able to identify issues with respect to clarity, with respect to what we are hearing or reading that's being presented by others. Okay, so and with respect to that, we will be going through, actually not 4. I've tried to provide the general roadmap here, but actually we'll be doing 5 things. So after we go through, I guess I would join the authors in suggesting there's kind of 4 general issues related to clarity, and so we'll go through each of those in turn. And then, like the authors, we'll also discuss, so kind of a 5th thing, writing. So clear, persuasive writing. So how to be a good writer, or things to keep in mind when it comes to writing well, if you will, and things a critical thinker at least should have in mind when it comes to trying to write as well as you can. Okay, so we'll be doing 5 main things, if you will, compared to what we've been up to, and I've intimated this all along, compared to what we've been up to in the previous sections. A lot of what we're going to discuss in this lecture is really straightforward. So for example, vagueness, I mean, we'll spend a couple slides covering that, and that'll be it, and we'll move on. So hopefully, I guess the point there is, if you've found yourself, if you're taking the course and you've found yourself sort of struggling up to this point, hopefully you'll find that the material that we discuss, that's tested in terms of the second part of the course, sections 3 and 4, that it's much easier, I would say, than what we've been dabbling with up to this point, especially in that second section when we're doing truth functional and categorical logic. That's some pretty difficult material. But anyway, I don't mean to suggest that this is a piece of cake by any means, right? You're still going to have to take it obviously seriously and do the homework exercises and so on. Some of this can be actually very tricky. So again, I didn't mean to suggest that it's super easy or anything like that, but compared to, again, some of the stuff we've been wrestling with up to this point in the course, I just think it's worth emphasizing that the material we're dealing with now is relatively easy compared to that, because a lot of students at this point, they're looking for some sort of something to look forward to, some degree of hope, if you will. Not that everybody's bombing the course, if you will, but that stuff again that we discussed in the last section, it's difficult. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in then to lecture 7 and our discussion of clarity. So turning to slide 2 of the lecture notes, we're going to begin by discussing this concept or this idea of vagueness. Right, so number 1 up here. So at the top of slide 2, I come out and cite, actually this is the 10th edition, page 72 from the 10th edition, their definition of what vagueness amounts to. So as they say there, quote, a word or phrase is vague if the group of things to which it applies has borderline cases, end quote. So the point is that if something is vague, quote, this is from page 74 of our text, our current edition, it's the sort of thing about which reasonable people could disagree, end quote. So that's what I'm trying to capture here. The general issue when it comes to something being vague, or this idea of vagueness, is that it's not clear what counts. Okay, so there's all kinds of examples here, and in some sense, I was kind of thinking, is it? I guess it kind of boils down to things that are subjective in some sense, right? Anything that we've had discussions of objective or subjective, and anything that we would sort of label as being a subjective issue, and in some sense, you could label as being vague, right? Beautiful, that's beautiful. What counts? I mean, we can have, again, I think a good way of grasping the issue with respect to vagueness is to keep in mind that second quote. It's the sort of thing about which reasonable people could disagree, okay? Just because you disagree with me about what constitutes something being beautiful doesn't mean that you're insane or that your idea is crazy, right? Arguably, it's just your opinion is just as valid or good as mine, okay? So it's that sort of creates the issue then, right? Because you might be inclined to say that this particular painting is beautiful and I'm not, and that's it's a vague issue. And is there a right or wrong answer? No, arguably no. And so that's again some of the issues related to subjective issues that we talked about way back with that lecture 2. Okay, so again, anything that's kind of subjective in nature, I would argue, is then something that can be construed as being vague. A difficult logic exam. Well, what constitutes difficult? Someone who is a really good student and very intelligent, maybe, something that would be difficult for them is going to be way harder than the average everyday person taking a logic exam. So again, difficult, that idea of being difficult is a vague concept. Cool, someone being cool, right? Or even, so cool, hey, they're really cool. Right, that is vague, but also even it's cool in here. Even the idea of being hot or cold in, say, a particular room or environment. Again, what does that amount to? It can depend on the person and what it means to be hot or cold. In some sense, that's vague as well. Okay, awesome, you're totally awesome. I mean, that's kind of the same issue as being cool in that first sense that I talked about, right? Again, vague in a similar sense. Okay. What the awesome dude for me might be totally different from the awesome dude for you. Right? What constitutes torture, right? What does torture look like? That could be completely different for you as opposed to what it looks like for me. And maybe even what it means to be logical. I would argue that a lot of what we're up to in this course is to try to suggest that no, right, there is some objective kind of standard that a critical thinker can adhere to, right? So with respect to a lot of this. So I would try to argue that no, being logical isn't necessarily vague, but you could argue in some sense what it means to even be logical, right? Somebody, right, we have debates about critical issues all the time between reasonable people, okay? So they both think they're logical, okay? So are they? Now, again, I think the upshot of a lot of what we're suggesting in this course is to try to suggest that there is ultimately a right and wrong when it comes to whether or not, I guess, something is logical or not, right? It's it's valid or it's invalid, for example. So whether or not that's vague, I guess we could have debates about that. But hopefully you kind of get the idea here with respect to what it means to be vague, okay? Again, what counts in terms of that term, what qualifies, right? It's not entirely clear. In other words, we can have reasonable debates about what counts, okay? I do like turning this to slide 3, what the authors point out. I think a very important point, especially if you're political at all. I'm rather apolitical, but I have a sort of mind for this and look out for this all the time. Politicians and sort of political jargon, right? It's oftentimes intentionally vague. Okay? That way you cannot hold them accountable, politicians. For example, so one sort of thing I kind of came up with. Imagine a politician saying, look, work with me here. So they just instituted a plan, right? And they say, look, no doubt this plan will take a long time for its benefits to come to fruition. Well, that idea of a long time, right? They throw that in there. It's in some sense it could be intentionally, them being vague because that, what does that mean? A long time? Is that a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 100 years? Right? And so if you couch it in such a way, in a vague sort of fashion, as a politician, for example, right, then, 20 years down the road, when we still haven't seen all of the positive effects from the plan you instituted, you can go back and say, well, I said it would take a long time, right? And we can't say, well, you were wrong because you said a long time. And, you could say, well, that for me, that means 100 years. Of course, for most of us, it meant 10 years or a year, So hopefully you get the idea there, right? I mean, you could see why politicians make use of, this issues, or not issues, but sometimes intentionally are vague, right? So that they can't be, in some sense, held as accountable. Okay. The authors, that is, they also point out that, look, this applies to when we talk about generality as well. You can insist that someone try to be as specific as possible, and you could just keep going and going and going, right? Same thing with vagueness. We can insist that someone be more specific and be more specific. There's a certain line, right? We have to accept some degree of vagueness, if you will, in our everyday parlance or everyday communication. Okay, otherwise things would get really weird, right? If we were constantly, asking people to clarify themselves when it wasn't really required, right? So again, the general point is, as the authors intimate, and this is the point at the bottom of slide 3, some degree of vagueness is involved in our usual everyday correspondence, right? But the general point is, though, be on guard against an undue degree of vagueness, if you will, right? Where it seems like it's muddying the waters to an extent where it is hard to decide what's right, what's wrong, whether or not the policy is a good one or not, right? So there is, I guess, in some sense, right, we need to be on guard against this. Granted, we could also take it too far, right? And that's the point they're raising, that the authors raise. We could take it too far and just constantly insist that someone become more and more specific, or that they try to be less and less vague. But again, we have to, for the sake of getting anywhere, right, we have to accept, in some sense, some degree of vagueness in our everyday correspondence. Okay. I feel like I could have probably said that in a less vague manner or in a much more straightforward fashion, but hopefully you get the idea there. I found it kind of funny, so this is turning to slide 4. They didn't do anything between editions 10 and 13. So they provide the following standard when it comes to judging whether what someone says or writes is too vague, right? So I've just spent a while there kind of hammering home the point that we have to accept some degree of vagueness. Well, okay, but when is it too vague, right? So there's this general sort of issue, and that's a tough one, right? Obviously, that's why we're discussing it here. And so the authors try to offer a kind of principle or a standard with which to work, but I kind of find it laughable. So they say, quote, so this is from page 76, quote, when a claim is too vague to convey appropriately useful information, its level of vagueness is not acceptable. So again, that's from page 76, and this is the exact same standard they've used from at least the 10th edition. And actually this chapter, so I've referenced like changes between the 10th and the 13th edition. This chapter hasn't really been touched at all since the 10th edition, but I find this standard kind of questionable because it itself appeals to very vague concepts. So that's the point I'm kind of raising in the middle of slide 4, right? We could ourselves ask, what exactly constitutes appropriately useful information, okay? And whether that itself isn't vague, okay? But in general, you kind of get the author's point, right? That their point in general, okay? there is this issue of vagueness, and we have to be on guard against it. Granted, we're going to have to accept some degree of it to get by in our everyday lives. Okay? I think that's about as succinctly and well put as I can make that point. I spent 5 minutes earlier trying to spell what I just said there in 10 seconds, spell that out earlier. Anyway, okay, so I think that's all I have to say about vagueness. So these are all just, examples of concepts or terms that are considered vague or could be considered vague. Again, actually, I didn't put this one up there. Whether or not something is vague itself, right? Again, is logical vague? We could have debates about that. Therefore, it is itself vague, whether or not it's vague. Anyway, let's move on then to the second sort of element we want to discuss with respect to clarity, what's referred to as ambiguity. So here the issue is not some sort of like, another example I meant to reference with respect to vagueness that I was discussing with my family earlier, and they mentioned baldness in the chapter, right? Well, what exactly constitutes baldness? Right? So completely bald, no hair on top of your head, that's clearly bald. But what about someone with like a few whiskers up there? So my kids really like the Simpsons. So Homer Simpson, is he bald? He's got a few whiskers up there. And so my wife said, well, he's bald, but not completely bald. And so then you have the whole issue, well, then okay, so completely bald is 0 hairs, right? But what's bald then? So 1 to 17 hairs, right? So anyway, so that's another example that we got into our family. What constitutes being bald? Again, going back to one of the examples the authors alluded to in the text as well. That is a great example of a vague term or vague concept, being bald. Okay. With respect to ambiguity, though, the issue is not knowing what counts or not, but the term itself or what's being said is open to 2 or more interpretations. So it's not that we're not sure how to interpret it. Well, let's see, how do I put it? It's not that the term itself, we're not sure like what counts as being bald, for example, but what is being expressed, right? We know definitively what would count, but which of multiple interpretations we could have of it, that's sort of the issue. So we say that's an issue in ambiguity. So this is the top of slide 5. So as I mentioned at the top of slide 5, as opposed to cases of vagueness, it's a lot clearer when we have a case of ambiguity. So this is from page 76 of the text. Quote, a word, phrase, or sentence is said to be ambiguous when it has more than one meaning. That's, I guess, a much better way of putting it. So examples, Jessica is renting her house. Okay, well, again, we know what it means to rent, right? It's not that it's vague, okay, but the way that's expressed, Jessica's renting her house, that could either mean Jessica owns a property and is renting it to someone, or the property she's living in or residing in, she's renting from someone else, right? We don't know. So again, that's an example from 76. Okay, another, I like this one from 76. Another example, quote, minors refuse to work after death, end quote. Okay, again, that's kind of open, to be interpreted in a few different ways. Okay? Minors refuse to work after death. Does that mean after they die, they're not going to work anymore? Or does that mean someone died and now these certain minors are refusing to work because of the conditions or whatever? All right, so we know in that example, right, we know that they're not refusing to work after they die, right, in some afterlife. That's not what whoever expressed this, that's not what they intended, right? But that is an available interpretation, right? And that's why that we would render that expression ambiguous. What they probably meant, right, is that something deplorable happened, someone died, and so all the other workers are refusing to work, right? But again, given what was expressed, minors refuse to work after death, it's open to both those equally valid interpretations, if you will. Another example I give on the bottom of slide 5, critical thinking. So here's an example. Okay. Does this refer to the subject of our course, for example? right? Analytical sort of, thinking, or does it refer to thinking that criticizes? Okay, that's sort of negative. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a kind of general sense of what it means for something to be ambiguous. So we say something is ambiguous. Is that how you spell it? Ambiguous, I think so. Actually, I don't know that that's there. Anyway, we do want to discuss, as I've shown here, two basic kinds of ambiguity. So on the one hand, we have what's known as semantic ambiguity, when the issue reflects a certain word or term. And then we have what's known as syntactic ambiguity, when the issue, the reason why what's expressed is open to two or more interpretations is not because of a word or a phrase, but because of the structure of what's being said. So again, the word or phrase versus the structure of what's being said, two different sources of ambiguity. Okay, so first we'll discuss this idea of semantic ambiguity. So the critical issue here is that what's being expressed contains an ambiguous word or phrase. So this is from the top of slide 6. Okay, so I like their example. This is one, again, that they've been working with since at least the 10th edition. So from page 77 of our edition, the 13th edition, somebody says, quote, Collins, the running back, always lines up on the right side. The running back always lines up on the right side. Okay, so here we have an issue or a case of semantic ambiguity because of this idea of the right side. Okay, does that mean he lines up? So we have two different possibilities here, right? On the one hand, it could mean he always lines up on the right side as opposed to the left side. Or it could be, consider a coach saying this, right? He always lines up on the correct side. So again, two equally sort of seemingly valid interpretations given what's said here. Okay, that's why we would render this ambiguous, and it's a case of semantic ambiguity because it comes down to a particular word or concept that's ambiguous. Okay, and by the way, so I mentioned this in the bottom, slide 6. As critical thinkers, we want to avoid this. If we're not politicians and we want to be clear with respect to what we're saying, we want to avoid this kind of ambiguity. So we would try to disambiguate what we're saying, right? When we recognize these sorts of instances of ambiguity, we try to rectify it by disambiguating this sort of expression, right? And we'd say something instead, like we would change that. Let's say we meant we're the coach, right? And we're saying, hey, Ben Collins, sign him up. To avoid any ambiguity, we might say he always lines up on the correct side. Okay, so that would be an example of disambiguating that previously ambiguous claim, okay, or comment. Okay, and so again, obviously, as critical thinkers, we're trying to avoid, unless we're politicians just trying to gain office, we're trying to avoid a lack of clarity, right? We want to be as clear as possible, typically, and so we would want to disambiguate those types of ambiguous statements, okay, and render them more clear in that sort of fashion. Okay, so turning to, where is this? Slide 7, we have a particular type of semantic ambiguity. So I meant to put this up here, actually. So one particular type is known as the grouping ambiguity. Whoops, I forgot to put that up here. And that's, again, a particular type of semantic ambiguity. And that comes down to when we're not sure whether a term refers to individuals within a group or the group itself, okay? Hence the grouping ambiguity. Okay? So I guess in the words of the authors, this comes from, so this is again the top of slide 7 of the lecture notes, comes from page 77 of the 13th edition. So this is a kind of semantic ambiguity, grouping ambiguity, wherein, quote, it is not clear whether a word is being used to refer to a group collectively or to members of the group individually. And so they give, I think, a good example where they say, so the next quote there, quote, secretaries make more money than physicians do. So this is a case of semantic ambiguity, particularly the grouping ambiguity, because, and so this illustrates, it's a good example because it illustrates sort of an issue, right? Why ambiguity can be problematic, because on the one hand, taken one way, this is a true claim, but taken another way, it's false. Okay, so that's why it's particularly problematic, and why we need to be able to, as critical thinkers, we need to be able to recognize these sorts of instances and push someone. If somebody says this to us, well, what do you mean, right? Are you taking it this way or that way? So, because if somebody says, again, secretaries make more money than physicians do, well, how are we taking secretaries there, right? And physicians, is this as a whole or individual by individual, right? So as I mentioned in the bottom of slide 7 there, collectively it's true, as there's thousands, if not millions more secretaries than there are physicians or doctors, okay? But if taken, individually, okay, it's not going to be true, because the physician or the doctor on average is going to make more than the secretary, okay? So again, that is an example of semantic ambiguity, particularly the grouping ambiguity. Okay, so that's our discussion of semantic ambiguity. Turning to slide 8, we will then move on to this idea of syntactic ambiguity. So as I intimated earlier, this comes down to not issues with a particular word or concept, but rather it boils down to the structure of what's being said or expressed, given the structure itself is problematic and the source of the ambiguity. So as the authors put it from page 77, so this is top of slide 8, this type of ambiguity, so syntactic ambiguity, quote, occurs when a claim is open to 2 or more interpretations because of its structure, that is, its syntax. So I like their example here. Classic, and you see this kind of stuff actually. This really reminds me of my own personal experience. So you see something like, you will need a birth certificate. Whoops. Or a driver's license. You will need a birth certificate or a driver's license and other photo ID. Okay. And seriously, you probably all seen something similar to this too, right? When you're trying to register for something, or you're trying to get something, and you see this sort of jargon. And I've honestly seen something very similar where I couldn't figure out, again, it's a case of syntactic ambiguity, what exactly I needed. And you shouldn't be able to figure it out either if this is what you're told, right? Because on the one hand, right, we could interpret it this way, okay? So you will need a birth certificate or a driver's license, okay, one of those two, and then also a photo ID, other photo ID, okay? But alternatively, and equally valid, we could say, right, or it could be, you will need a birth certificate, okay? Or you can have, right, so if you have a birth certificate, you're good to go, or you can have a driver's license and other photo ID. Right, well, which way is it? Which one is it? We don't know, given this expression. So I've outlined the 2 possibilities on the bottom of slide 8 there as well. All right, so that's a perfect example of syntactic ambiguity. How are we supposed to take this? And if we come across this in our everyday lives, we should be asking whoever is suggesting this, right? Well, what do you mean? What do you mean exactly? I'm not sure. Okay, so top of slide 9, often, as is the case here, right, syntactic ambiguity, issues with that come down to a lack of clarity with respect to logical operators. Now, we've already discussed, right, these logical operators in previous lectures, right, section 2, when we did truth functional logic and the like, right? But it's a lot of times it'll boil down to a lack of clarity with respect to how those are supposed to be operating. Okay, and so that's what I point out at the top of slide 9. Now, just like we went over a particular example of semantic ambiguity, so too we have a particular example of syntactic ambiguity, known as ambiguous pronoun references. So these are pretty straightforward. As they point out, so this is the middle of slide 9. This is from page 78 of our text. Ambiguous pronoun references are a kind of syntactic ambiguity wherein, quote, it is not clear to what or whom a pronoun is supposed to refer, end quote. So I like their example. So this is also from page 78. Quote, the boys chased the girls and they giggled a lot. Well, who giggled? We all know it was the boys, but was it? We don't actually know, right? Was it the girls or the boys? Okay, they, we don't know who to whom they is supposed to apply, right? So the boys chased the girls and they giggled a lot. Again, who does they apply to, the boys or the girls? So that's a case of an ambiguous pronoun reference, right? The they in that scenario, we don't know whether it refers to the boys or the girls. Okay? And in general, that's an example of syntactic ambiguity. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the third element we'll discuss with respect to clarity, and that's the general idea of generality. The general idea of generality. So what is generality in general? Well, according to authors, this is from page 79, so this is the top of slide 10 of the lecture notes, citing page 79 of the textbook, quote, generality is a lack of specificity. And, quote, roughly speaking, the less detail a claim provides, the more general it is, end quote. This is very straightforward, and we all get this, I think, intuitively, right? So the example I give you at the bottom, Professor Poof is a teacher, is more general than Professor Poof is a philosophy teacher, which is more general than Professor Poof is a crazy philosophy teacher, which is more general than Professor Poof is a crazy philosophy teacher at the University of Kansas, right? So the first expression was the most general, and then it got more and more specific, right, or less general, if you will, the further on we got there. So again, pretty straightforward. And this can be an issue and something that's probably frustrated all of us at some point in our lives when someone is too general, right, for our liking, or given the context, right, it's an issue. And we need to be on the lookout for that as critical thinkers. So imagine, for example, you get back and your roommate's gone. Your roommate, let's call him Tom, is gone. And you say, where'd Tom go? You ask your third roommate, where'd Tom go? And Bill, your other roommate, goes, he left. That's too general, right? You're not going to be satisfied with that response. I know he left. I said, where'd he go? Right? So he left is more general than he left for a few hours, which is more general than he left for a few hours to get groceries, which is more general than he left for a few hours to get, eggs and bacon for the morning, okay, and so on and so forth. So again, something we want to kind of be on guard against, as if critical thinkers presenting, let's say we're doing, writing a persuasive essay, we want to be as clear as possible. We want to try to be as, again, this is kind of a fine line. You don't want to, there's a point at which you can go overboard, right? You don't want to inundate the person with too many details. So the person, you say, where'd Tom go? Well, at precisely 3:07 p.m., he grabbed his wallet, which he couldn't find at first, and he found it under the secretary after looking for 5 minutes, and decided, after considering whether to walk or not, to ride his bike. He decided to go to the grocery store. Too many details, okay? But in general, right, we want to be on guard against, or be able to sort of navigate that issue, right? Be able to sort of say, hey, you need to be more specific in cases where it's too general. But again, not be overly demanding and demand too much specificity, if you will, or when answering someone's question, not offer too many specifics. And that can also be an issue. But again, hopefully, you kind of get the general idea here. This issue of generality can be sort of an issue, a contentious issue for the critical thinker. And one of the things you'll be asked to do, right, is sort of rank things that are expressed, what's most general to least general, or the most specific to least specific, which I think is pretty straightforward for the most part. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our fourth element that we're going to discuss here, and that's the importance of definitions. So a lack of clear definitions, that is a huge problem when it comes to, I would say, in philosophy in particular, but a lot of academic discussions and discussions in general. If people were just clear with respect to what they mean by certain terms, or offered their definitions, with respect to what they mean by certain terms, I think it would go a long way, and we would have a much greater degree of clarity than we generally seem to have. So I think this is an incredibly important issue, this idea of definitions. So we'll join the authors of the textbook in discussing three general purposes for definitions, and then three general types of definitions. And these are kind of distinct, right? It's one thing to discuss why someone's offering a definition, what the purpose is in them offering the definition. It's another thing to discuss the kind of definition they're offering, regardless of what their purpose in offering the definition is. So let's go ahead and turn our attention first to the idea of the purposes behind these definitions, what our definition is, what we're intending to do by defining the term. That can vary, again, depending on what someone's intention is. Are they running for office, for example? Or they might be trying to accomplish one thing. Are they just trying to give an average everyday sense of a term, and they're trying to do something else? Okay, so what is the purpose behind the definition? We'll say that there's three general purposes, if you will. So again, joining the authors. So the first purpose or reason in offering a definition is just to give an average everyday sense of what the word means. Okay, that's what's known as a lexical definition. It's a dictionary definition, if you will. Okay, so lexical definitions, and this is the bottom of slide 11, quote, tell us what a word ordinarily means. Okay, and that's from page 84. In other words, they're dictionary definitions. Okay, so if the intent is solely just to convey the average everyday ordinary sense of the term, then it's a lexical definition. Okay. Alternatively, turning to slide 12, okay, we have what are known as precising and stipulative definitions. Now, they used to distinguish these more in the previous editions or iterations of the textbook, but here they just kind of lump them together, and that's fine. They really are doing kind of the same thing. Both of them are aiming to how should I put it? Render something more clear. So it's not just to convey what the word means in average everyday sense, but there's some issue of clarity involved, and so the intent of the person offering the definition, right? They're trying to remedy that lack of clarity in some fashion. Okay. So, excuse me. Going to the top of slide 12, I say precising or stipulative definitions, or actually they say, this is from page 84 of the text. These definitions, quote, are designed to make a term more precise, i.e. less vague or general. That's in the case of the precising definition, or to stipulate a new or different meaning from the ordinary one, and that's what we have in the case of a stipulative definition. Okay. So let me give you an example of a precising definition. So in general, both these are aiming to, again, reduce a lack of clarity. Okay, so precising. So if you enjoyed sports, you might hear the phrase star player bantied about frequently. And let's say you have a sports writer who wants to make it clear what exactly they mean by star player. So they might, at the beginning of their article, they might offer a precising definition. So what I mentioned in the middle of slide 12, star players will be used only to refer to players that have participated in 3 or more all-star games. Okay, so here we have an example where we're trying to make it more precise what exactly we mean by this, okay, by spelling it out in clearer terms. Okay. So I also mentioned, okay, this is the bullet point right after that. Recall our discussion of sampling frames in chapter 11 or the lecture 6, the previous lecture. The definitions of a population and the feature of interest, okay, comprising them, those are precising definitions as well. they're spelling out, right? So remember, so when someone's interested in a specific population and a particular feature, right, and they spell out, the researcher spells out, well, what exactly constitutes being a member of the population and what exactly it means to have that feature of interest, okay? They're offering a sampling frame. Well, they're offering precising definitions. Okay, so then moving on to the very bottom, I offer you an example of a stipulative definition. Again, it's similar in that you're trying to reduce a lack of clarity. And in this instance, and with respect to a stipulative definition, what's going on here is usually you're taking a term that tends to have a general meaning, right? And you're going to actually use that term in maybe a different way or a slightly different fashion. And so you make that clear, right? You stipulate that, hey, I'm going to use this particular word to mean this, right? So desktop in on a computer, we all kind of know that now, but imagine way back when computers were first introduced, how that could have been problematic to just throw out the word desktop without any explanation when you were referring to a computer, right? And that, how is it? How do they define it? This is from 84. It means the basic operating screen of the basic opening screen of the operating system for a computer. Imagine, right, that we just threw out the term desktop way back when computers were first being introduced. But nobody would really know what, that had that other sort of meaning, and they would be incredibly confused. And so someone at the time, if they were trying to be helpful, they would offer a stipulative definition, and they'd say, look, what we mean by a desktop, it's not like this, right? But it's, again, that basic opening screen of an operating system. Okay? So that's an example, again, of a stipulative definition. And both of these aim to reduce a lack of clarity, right? Aim to render something more clear. That's the chief objective in offering the definition. Okay? And then finally, we have the third type, persuasive rhetorical definitions. Okay. So this is the top of slide 13. Persuasive rhetorical definitions, quote, are designed to influence beliefs or attitudes, not simply to convey linguistic information, end quote. And often they make use of what's known as emotive meaning. So here the intention is not to simply convey what the word means in an average everyday sense, or to make it clear what might otherwise be a confusing term, but rather the person is trying to convince people, right, to persuade them, to influence their behavior and their beliefs. Okay, that's the chief objective when it comes to persuasive and rhetorical definitions. Okay, so we want to especially be, I would say, on guard against these as critical thinkers. Anything that's so as mentioned, right, it's making it, these types of definitions oftentimes make appeal to emotive meaning, right? The emotionally charged nature of certain words and concepts, right? They appeal to those to make us feel strongly one way or another. And remember, critical thinking, part of being a good critical thinker is to try to be as neutral and objective as possible and to focus, remember way back on what Aristotle was saying, right? The logos, the rational, logical elements of what's being said, divorced of any emotional qualities. Okay, so again, all the more reason to be on guard as critical thinkers when it comes to these persuasive or rhetorical definitions, because they're trying typically to appeal to our emotions and not to what's logical, if you will. Okay. So just to give you an example of a persuasive or rhetorical definition and kind of how it appeals to that emotionally charged language, right? Defining abortion, so this is the bottom of slide 13. If one were to define abortion as, quote, the murder of an unborn child, end quote. So that's from 85 on the 10th edition. That's going to immediately, if you define something that way, it's going to immediately spark certain emotions for whoever's hearing it, right? And so that's oftentimes intentionally done then, right? If the person has a certain view and they want to get others to subscribe to that same view, right, they might employ this emotionally charged language. And again, as critical thinkers, we want to make sure we're not being unduly swayed by that sort of emotional language. Okay. Another example they give, defining conservative. So this is from page 85 of the 13th edition, our edition. Defining a conservative as, quote, a hidebound, narrow-minded hypocrite who thinks the point to life is making money and ripping off poor people, end quote. Again, that doesn't sound good. You're immediately stacking the deck against conservatives if that's how you define them, right? And again, someone offering that definition, that's probably what they're intending to do. Okay, so that will wrap up our discussion of, what we're trying to do, or what people are generally trying to do when offering definitions, right? What their purposes are. Okay, boils down to three basic reasons why we're offering definitions. Just want to give an average everyday sense of what the word means. We're trying to reduce there's some issue, right, that's with respect to clarity, and we're trying to render something clear, okay? Or we're trying to influence behaviors and beliefs, okay, and using emotionally charged language to do so typically. And now let's talk about the types of definitions we can employ, regardless of what our intention is in offering the definition, the different types of definitions we can offer. Okay. So this is then slide 14. So there's three basic types or kinds, if you will. Okay, we'll join the authors in discussing these three basic types. So a definition by example, as I mentioned, this is pretty much the top of slide 14. This is provided by, quote, pointing to, naming, or otherwise identifying one or more examples of the sort of thing to which the term applies. So definition by example. I like my example here. So an example of this would be, by freaks, I mean people like you. Okay, so here we're defining freaks, or a freak, by giving an example, namely you. Okay, so that's the first way we can give a definition, is just through offering an example of what we mean by the term or concept. Okay. Alternatively, we can offer what's known as a definition by synonym. Okay. So, as I mentioned, this is the number 2 bullet point in the middle of slide 14. This is provided by, quote, giving another word or phrase that means the same thing as the term being defined, end quote. So that's taken from page 85. So, for example, you might hear someone say, envious means jealous. Okay. You're just defining, in this case, envious by offering, right, a synonym. Okay, another word that means exactly the same thing. Okay, and then finally, we have what's known as an analytical definition. Whoa. Analytical definition. And, well, I'll just read what I guess they say first. This is from the bottom of slide 14, page 85 from the text. So such a definition is provided when, quote, specifying the features that a thing must possess in order for the term being defined to apply to it. So I kind of think of it like a criterial list, right? So it's almost like they're providing a checklist of what must be satisfied in order for something to qualify as that term, or to qualify, right? So I guess let me give you an example. A crazy person is, so that's what we're defining, right? A human being who exhibits too little common sense and too much reckless behavior. So here's what we're defining, right? And it's like you're given kind of, like I said, a criterial list is a human being who exhibits too little common sense and too much reckless behavior. All right, so as I mentioned also, bottom slide 14, a lot of dictionary definitions will take this form, right? Again, you're kind of just outlining all these things that something has to satisfy in order to qualify for this, right? So is Joe Blow a crazy person? It depends. Are they a human being who exhibits too little common sense and too much reckless behavior? If yes, then sure, they're a crazy person. If not, then no. Okay, so that's what we mean by an analytical definition. So turning to slide 15, with regard to our subject, critical thinking and good argumentation, there are a few things to keep in mind. So they sort of, again, reference these key things to kind of keep in the back of our minds, if you will, when it comes to definitions. What is a good definition, right? Sort of how should we approach that? They mention, so this is from page 85 of the text, quote, definitions are instances in which people have to try to achieve a kind of neutral ground. As, quote, one cannot usually win a debate simply by insisting on one's own favorite definition of key terms, since those who disagree with your position will also disagree with your definition, end quote. And I think that's a very important point, right? You don't want to come out, and I'll talk about this. This is an important point when it comes to writing in general. You want to be as neutral as possible, at least come across as being as neutral as possible. Okay, and if you're coming out and throwing out these extremely biased rhetorical definitions right off the bat, that's not going to endear anyone to your position or what you have to say. Okay, so I agree with the authors that when it comes to definitions, right, you have to be careful, and this is, again, you want to try to find some, as they put it, some sort of neutral ground, right, with your definitions, right? You want to find a place to start. If you come out and you want to have a discussion on abortion, and you immediately define what abortion is as the murder of an unborn child, I mean, you know, all your opponents are just going to sigh and shrug and not want to have anything to do with you because they know that they're not going to get anywhere, right? If you're coming out and immediately offering definitions like that, right, which stack the deck against them, okay, it's going to be hard for anyone to argue against the murder of an unborn child, right, when presented that way. Okay, so that's what we're saying. That's what the authors are getting at. Okay, even if you feel like that's what's really the case, right, if you want to accomplish anything through a debate or through a discussion, you better not define abortion that way, okay, because you're not going to get anywhere with anyone that remotely disagrees with you. Okay, that's the point. Even if you think that's actually what's going on, right, you shouldn't proceed in insisting on defining things in that fashion. Okay? I think that's a fair way to put it. And then they mention this as well. I mean, as I suggest, it's almost so straightforward it should go without saying, but you know, when it comes to definitions, we want to be as clear as possible, right? That's oftentimes what we're trying to do with definitions is clarify, particularly these types, right? So try to, when you're defining your terms, try to be as clear as possible in doing so. Okay. I think that's everything I wanted to say with respect to these four main elements of clarity, with respect to clarity that the authors outline and go through, and then we've done so as well. So now what I want to do is discuss a kind of fifth element, as they do as well. Basically, this idea of good writing, becoming a better writer, improving your writing, however you want to put it. So in this section 3 of the course, if you're taking the course, in your homework assignments, you will be required to do some brief writing assignments. So nothing too extensive, right? It's 1 to 2 pages, double spaced in Times New Roman or Calibri font. And these are just meant to try to get you to practice some of the things that are introduced here at the end of this chapter, which is chapter 3, by the way. So I should point that out. Lecture 7 here with respect to clarity correlates then to chapter 3 of the 13th edition. So in the chapter 3 homework, the chapter 4 homework, and the chapter 5 homework, you'll be required to do a writing assignment. Again, don't make too much of it. You don't have to follow. I had a student ask me, do I have to do MLA format? Yada, yada, yada. No, don't worry about that. The main thing I want you to practice is what we'll articulate here in the next couple of slides, and what they emphasize at the end of chapter 3, these basic principles of good writing. That's what I'm really worried about. Not that you follow particular, formatting guidelines and so on. Okay, but I did want to draw your attention to that in the Section 3 homework assignments, you will be required to do these writing assignments. Again, nothing too dramatic, 1 to 2 page writing assignments, double spaced, so Times New Roman or Calibri font, 12-point font, by the way. So, what am I looking for in those assignments? Exactly what we point out on slide 16, the 4 elements of any good argumentative writing, and these are what they highlight on page 87 of the text. Okay, so you should come out and state the issue, and whatever it is that you're discussing, that should be clear. Okay, so if you're going to try to convince the readers that abortion's wrong or abortion's okay, right, that should be clear that you're discussing abortion. The abortion is the issue. So a clear statement of the issue itself. 1. Okay, 2. A clear statement of your own position on the issue. Okay, so it's one thing what the issue is. Okay. But then it's another thing to state your position on the issue. Okay, so 2 key points. Those need to be obvious and very clear and straightforward in your writing. Okay, make sure that that is the case. And the third thing, 3 and 4 are kind of go together in some sense, in that you are basically supporting 2, right? So you've stated your position on the issue. So 3 is like state your arguments for your position. Okay. And then the 4th thing is like, how do I want to put it? Counter arguments to opposition's position, if you will, which is, again, kind of the same thing. I mean, position. If you're offering reasons why all the alternative positions aren't correct, then you're actually offering arguments for your own position in some way, right? But you can see the distinction here. So John Stuart Mill, I mentioned him at the bottom of slide 16 as being someone who's really good at this, and that's one thing that I always really admire about Mill, is his ability to actually like address what the opposition would say almost before they even articulated their counter argument. So he would anticipate the rebuttals to his position and sort of address them ahead of time. So that's a great quality. You need to do, again, both. That's one thing, right? But then stating your position or stating the arguments in favor of your position itself is another thing, right? So going back to Mill, so he, for example, with respect to ethics, his position is utilitarian. He's a utilitarian, so he's advocating utilitarianism. Do whatever moral situation you're confronted with, do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So, if he's trying to be a good writer or present good writing, he's hopefully offering several arguments for his position. But then, as I mentioned, Mill is inclined to do, he's also then going to address sort of address why alternative positions then aren't viable either. So he'll say why the utilitarians, right? What's so good about utilitarianism here? Okay, but then he'll also address what's so bad about, say, deontology, or virtue ethics, these alternative competing moral theories. He'll also address those and say what's problematic in these alternative views, okay, or what's wrong with what the virtue ethicists say, or what's wrong with what the deontologists say. Right, so you're going to try to do both these things, okay? And again, I think they're kind of doing the same thing, right? You're basically, both of them are ultimately aiming to support your position on the issue. Why is it you take your stance? Right? Well, you're taking your stance because you have these certain arguments for your position, and you also find the arguments for the other positions unconvincing. Okay. Turning to, so those are the, and I agree with the authors, these are the 4 major elements. If you're going to have a good piece of writing, right, that you need to make sure is there a clear, concise statement of the issue, and then also your position on the issue, and then, right, your support of it, either by way of directly supporting your own position or saying what's problematic with the other alternatives. Okay, so I guess I wanted to end, so turning to slide 17, by just offering some general reflections on good argumentative writing, if you will. So a lot of this, so I mentioned this in the bottom of slide 17, the authors reference a lot of these points as well, and they discuss some tips for good writing on pages 88 to 91 of the 13th edition. Okay, so we've all probably heard this at this point, you know, taking a college course, you know, you want to try to hook the reader's attention, grab the reader's attention. So that's the point I'm making at the top of slide 17. That's something the authors pointed out in the text. Okay, you can begin by telling a brief anecdotal story that's pertinent to the issue, or by asking a kind of rhetorical question. You do want to grab the reader's attention. Now, having said that, I almost think we've all heard this, right? And I think students are almost pay too much attention to this, and because it's almost, you can kind of tell when a student has this in mind, because sometimes they'll just, at the very beginning, they'll just go off on, again, some story, and that'll be end up being half of what they say is just this somewhat related but very tangentially like story that they introduced at the very beginning that ends up taking up half of their argumentative essay, if you will. So I almost think, so kind of my own 2 cents on this as well. Yes, it's important. You want to grab your reader's attention, but don't get bogged down by this. Don't make it more than it is. I mean, you don't want to just ramble on and on about, you know, in the first paragraph, right? And ramble on and on about some story that's only somewhat related. Okay, just get into it. At least this is my experience. I'd much prefer just get into, you know, your reason, state what it is you're going to talk about and what your position is, and just get into the meat of it. By and large, I think that's much preferred to the long rambling introduction. Okay, but going back, so just be on guard against that. But you do want to. There is a sense in which you want to hook your readers, obviously. Okay. Second bullet point there on slide 17. Yeah, I'd say this is probably the most important. Your essay, especially in philosophy, you know, when you're dealing with arguments and you really got to follow one, you know, how things connect from, you know, one point to the next. What you're saying has to be well structured. Okay, we have to know everything you're saying has to be there for a reason. So if anything you're saying isn't adding to the essay in general, take it out. Definitely, that's something I've learned over the years. And kind of going on to that rambling point, right? We should, no matter what it is you're saying, we should be able to figure out, the reader should be able to immediately know why it is you're saying what you're saying. Sometimes, so when I'll grade essays, sometimes in my ethics class, for example, sometimes I'll come to a point like, well, how does this relate to anything you said before or after, for that matter? That is not something you want to have happen for your readers, right? So again, that's the point here. You want your essay to be extremely well structured. Okay? You should be going from point to point in a fashion that's easy to follow, that's not going to raise any questions for your reader. And I think I like the way they put it. So this is from page 88. I don't have this cited in the lecture notes, but I just flagged this though earlier today. So they say, again, this is from page 88 of the text. A reader should be able to discern the relationship between any given sentence and your ultimate objective. And he or she should be able to move from sentence to sentence and from paragraph to paragraph without getting lost or confused. Totally agree. Okay. So, you know, outlining. That is something I did more and more the more upper level I got in terms of my classes and my papers, because it became more and more critical. And the more academically minded you become, if that's your prerogative, the more important it is going to be to become a really good writer. Now, I would say, and actually one of my general points at the very bottom bullet point on slide 17. Becoming a good writer is important for anyone, no matter what walk of life you'll go down. If you have an issue, you need to be able to convey it, right? Sometimes you're going to need to be able to write a letter to the utility company that it adequately expresses your concerns with the bill that you received, right? Everyone benefits, I think, from becoming a better writer, but in particular, though, in academia and so on, if you want to pursue that path, it becomes more and more important, right? That they become extremely structured, and that your writing is like a well-oiled machine. That's not the right way to put it. That everything you say in your writing matters, right? That there's nothing sort of superfluous. Everything matters, and it is sequenced properly, right? The structure makes sense, and the reader knows why it is you're saying what you're saying at every given point. Okay, that's what we should shoot for, ideally, in academia and in general, I would say, right? And that's the goal, right? And that's the objective of good argumentative writing, I would say, what we're after ultimately. So the third bullet point, main bullet point, there's no excuse for sloppy writing. Okay? If you want your writing to be respected, you can't have grammatical errors. Okay? Especially, in an academic setting in particular, right? You turn in an exam or an essay to an instructor and you don't capitalize anything, you don't use proper punctuation. That's going to matter, right? It matters whether you think it should or not. And so too, whether we're in academia or not, you send a letter that is poorly written, grammatically speaking, to whoever, to the utility company, it's going to make less of an impression than it otherwise would. So grammar matters. Proofread what you're writing. Okay, it does matter. It might seem, what does this matter? It's pretentious to worry about it so much, or something like that. No, it does matter, and you might think, well, what's a matter here and there, but let me tell you, again, grading essays constantly for my job, grammar does matter, and the more you making these grammatical issues, the more it plagues your writing and the less clear what you're saying as a whole is. It does actually influence, right, the clarity of what you're saying. So again, no excuse for sloppy writing. You really do need to pay attention to it. Revise. They talk about the importance of revising your work. We probably all heard this at this point, right, in our careers as students, the importance of revising your work. That definitely is true. I think I was mentioning outlining. I did that more and more and more the further involved in academia I got, just because when you outline, that's going to help the structure, right? Because you're going to make sure you're sticking to that structure from the outset. So I definitely would advise, again, depending on the context and what you're doing, I am an advocate of outlining, at least, again, depending on the context. Anything in academia, if it's a substantive paper at all, I would for sure outline it. And they mentioned, I think, the boons of outlining as well in the chapter 3 text. So I think I mentioned this earlier. Do check out pages 88 to 91 of the text for more tips on how to improve your writing skills. I think, again, just reiterate, as I mentioned at the very bottom of slide 17. I've told people this, often. The biggest thing I got out of going, at least, undergrad and arguably even my whole stint in academia, the biggest asset or the biggest thing I got from that was becoming a better writer. And it was a hard, arduous process for sure. I think I thought I was a lot better writer than I was, as a freshman going into undergraduate classes, and through some good professors, learned early on that might, wasn't really the case, and became over time, I would say, a much better writer. And again, the importance of that over time has really become clear to me. So I think again that's worth emphasizing, that it is something that is incredibly important. Your ability to write in a clear fashion, incredibly important, and something that you should aim to work on and improve as much as you can. And hence the impetus then for us doing a little bit of writing in this section 3 then. Speaking of which, I guess that's it for lecture 7. So in lecture 8, we'll turn our attention to issues with respect to credibility. When should we trust a particular source or a particular claim, and when should we be on guard or more suspicious of a claim or a source for a claim? So we'll dabble in issues of credibility, again in lecture 8. That'll correspond to chapter 4 of the text. Okay, so in this particular lecture, right, we talked all about clarity. Okay, we talked about the sort of 4 major elements with respect to clarity that can kind of get in the way, that we want to be cognizant of as critical thinkers: vagueness, ambiguity, generality, and right, issues with respect to definitions. Then we also talked about writing and elements that are important when it comes to becoming good writers, things to be on guard against, or things to try to avoid when it comes to your writing, and also things to make sure you sort of do, right? Address, for example, the main counter arguments, if you're familiar with any, to your own position. Make sure you address those and say what's problematic with respect to those. So we talked again about writing in general and what sort of some of the things that constitute good writing. Okay. So that's it. I will leave you then with the chapter 3 homework. Again, lecture 7, clarity, corresponds to chapter 3 in the text. And so the next time I see you, we will be discussing then credibility for lecture 8, which again corresponds to chapter 4 in the text. Thank you.